Hello, I'm Zach Salsgiver. Welcome to our special presentation of PA Wildlife Management. For many avid hikers, the Appalachian is the trail in the eastern part of the United States. The 2,200-mile trail runs from Georgia to Maine. 230 of those miles cut right through the middle of Pennsylvania's rocky terrain. When hikers come through PA, they expect rocks, tall ranging oaks, and to go through more than one pair of boots in the rough backcountry of Pennsylvania. For some hikers, they might not get everything they expect when it comes to those tall ranging oaks. For example, Michaud State Forest is the first part of Pennsylvania through hikers working from the south up will see on the border of PA and Maryland. For the most part, Michaud will give the hikers exactly what they covet, right up until you reach a 100-acre stand of trees clear-cut and burned on state land. Many hikers are thrown off by the site. Isn't the purpose of a state forest to protect the land and conserve its resources? After all, just about 100 years ago, we deforested most of the eastern United States. The fact is, in Pennsylvania and most, if not all states, do cut down large stands on state and federal territories. Today, we will analyze and take a look at why foresters say cutting down trees is an important process in, yes, conserving natural habitat and biological diversity. We will also take a look at what the impacts are on the stands, both good and bad. Joining me today will be Dr. Nathan Thomas from Shippensburg University and Michaud State Forester Philip Biche, who's a specialist in clear cutting and prescribed burns. Now, one of the first things that come to mind is why are state and federal conservation offices clear cutting hundreds of acres of land?
So on game lands specifically, game lands and the Game Commission is their job is to manage wildlife and the habitats that go along with it. And there are a lot of different ways to remove trees, shrubs, provide habitat, and collectively most of the game lands have enough space that there's a diversity of habitats. And providing a clear cut or generating a clear cut is one way to cause a resurgence in growth, which supports lots of different animals, including providing not immediately, but in the short term for many different species, including a large number of small mammal species, providing the cover. A lot of times they make brush piles associated with those clear cuts to support different organisms.
Phil, you were in charge of the clear cutting and burning operations at Michaud State Forest. Why do you guys do these extensive cut and burns?
Well, clear cutting, it's a regeneration practice for in which times where you may not have a lot of established regeneration on the ground, so you're going to go through and pretty much cut all the trees, and what's going to happen is those trees such as oaks are going to resprout off the stumps. So you're going to get a bunch of resprouting, which is your new growth. It creates early successional habitat for deer browse, for turkey poults, grouse habitat, and a whole wide array of other species that rely on that early successional growth pretty much for escape cover and food.
So for these habitats, the outcome of clear cutting seems to be a positive one in the long run, 10 years down the road, regenerating the forest and giving it new life. Now, Michaud, you guys do prescribe burns. What does this do for the habitats?
Yeah, so sometimes if you get a lot of undesirable species for whatever that stand is going to be, so if it's an oak stand, if you get a lot of birch, red maple, black gum, seed or saplings growing up, we'll go through and do a prescribed burn. What that'll do is it pretty much sets the stand back in succession, and it just gives the oaks that are established another shot at competing.
So these prescribed burns a lot of the times are low-laying fires, getting all the leaves and extra debris off the ground. They are really just helping the native species of oak that we want in our forest a chance to compete. They do grow slower than some of the other species, which can cause them to get lost underneath the faster-growing, less desirable species, such as maple. This is something that has always occurred naturally before fire suppression practices stands would regenerate through wildfires struck by lightning and other causes.
Studies have shown that these forests burn probably every, I'd say, maybe 10 to 50 years. You'd have major fires going through, and it could be a fire that it would start at one end of the forest, and just over the course of a month or so, because there was no active fire suppression, it would burn all the way up through.
Those natural fires created by lightning that burned across without any suppression were done every 10 to maybe 50 years. It was really just more of a random chance. You really couldn't control when it was going to happen, but it did help the forest. For the best biological outcome, how often should these cut and burns happen on state and federal lands?
For here in a perfect world, I'd say a lot of these stands, if you just had some low intensity burning every 10 to 15 years, I'd say that's pretty decent.
Now, whenever you are bringing in heavy equipment and cutting and burning hundreds of acres, there has to be at least some negative effects on the habitat in the short term, whether it's wildlife disturbing or bringing in the heavy equipment and tearing up the habitat. What are the short-term effects of cutting and burning on wildlife?
Clear cuts have a lot of problems in addition. So the literature has shown that since the 1970s, a lot of work's been done, and certain organisms do really well. As an ornithologist, one of the kind of my focus areas is on habitat management for different bird species, and golden-winged warblers are a great example. They do really well with clear cuts as long as a few standing trees are left. That's the habitat they want, and then that sort of early successional that follows that.
So it really is dependent on the species, but overall clear cutting is far more beneficial in most scenarios than selective cuts are. Emma Show, how are different species affected by this process, and what can you do to protect those species?
Yeah, a lot depends on the species that are in that area. Like if we have timber rattlesnake dens or gestation areas nearby, we probably won't have them doing the harvest during sensitive times, where if it's a den site where they're coming out of the dens around mid-April, that period that they're coming out of their dens and dispersing for the summer, we won't have the loggers in there working during that time. The same goes true when they're coming back into the dens, or if it's a gestation area. During that summertime when the females are gravid and they're at those gestation sites, we won't have them logging in those areas at all.
Now, whenever you bring in heavy equipment, it is going to disturb the wildlife. What precautions should be taken to protect the wildlife as much as possible in the short term? Because there are going to be some effects, but how do you limit those as much as possible?
The time of year matters a lot. You want to minimize disruption as much as possible, minimize the land as much as possible. One of my colleagues has worked with DCNR in providing some information, and he says working with amphibians and reptiles, cut in winter, they're not active. So you're limiting that. The ground is generally hard, the compression of that, the death of organisms by smashing burrows and other things is minimized.
So time of year is a big factor, but other than the rattlesnake populations, are there any other drawbacks to this process?
Yeah, I don't think there really is very much. You know, you go out and talk to a lot of our loggers, and they'll be running a skidder and look right over, and I mean, there's deer, 50, 100 yards away feeding. They get used to the machinery, and they're pretty quick, so I wouldn't say there's really any drawbacks to it.
Now, some parts of the ecosystem are more fragile than others, and one of those are waterways. When you clear cut near waterways, it creates problems.
And we know very well that clear cuts dramatically increase sedimentation, so any waterways. And clear cuts by state law, I think some of that's federal law as well, are required to be a certain distance from wetlands. That's ponds, streams, waterways. They need to have buffers to prevent all of that muddy sediment getting into those waterways. So that's going to be critical because that's going to impact fish and everything downstream as well.
Now, for a while, it has been a no management practice near waterways to stop that sedimentation from running off into the waterways. But at Michaud, you guys are starting to do some cutting near waterways.
Right now, we're kind of in a transition between a no management versus a limited amount of management that goes on in the stream buffers. Because the more studies are starting to show, they're starting to see that you actually need that disturbance still. You still need some kind of a large woody component in the stream system. So the longer we go without doing any kind of active management in those stream areas or wet areas, it's kind of counterproductive. So we are doing some limited amount of disturbance. As far as runoff issues or sedimentation, we're not clear cutting or anything right up to a stream where you're going to have some kind of sedimentation issue that's going on. But we still do allow more of like a selection type thing.
Now, a lot of people are going to be very skeptical about clear cutting, something that ravaged our nation with deforestation in the past. Why is clear cutting a better management solution than selective cutting?
The selective cutting that most people are familiar with leaves these stands of limited diversity. So you end up with a not very effective stand. It may be providing mass, but not providing cover. So by providing a clear cut, and then you can limit what comes back through a variety of techniques, it can be really effective when done properly.
After the process has taken place, you have cut and burned, the work is not done. You set out with a very specific goal.
One of the important things to do with clear cuts, and it's sort of a phased time piece, is to make sure that you get the trees back that you want. One of the big problems is red maples grow very rapidly, so you get these very dense stands of red maples, and over time other things will replace that, but you have to be careful on what's coming back in those, and that takes a lot of time. And
one of the biggest problems for state forest systems is public education. Hikers and other outdoorsmen alike are out enjoying nature and see these large stands cut down, and for good reason, they are upset. Many see it as destroying natural habitat, but a little education goes a long way.
We have that site right up in the Dead Woman's Hollow area where we just had a big mowing project, and a lot of people were unsure of it at first, but once you start educating them as to why you're doing it and the long-term benefits of it, they really are on board with it. Up there, it's a sensitive site for scrub oak barrens habitat, and there are a lot of rare and endangered, globally rare moth species that depend on that. So once you start telling them, hey, we're doing this to basically better the habitat for all these species that depend on it, I mean, they're very supportive of it.
So hikers and outdoorsmen alike, when you're walking through PA state game lands or Michaud State Forest and see logging companies ripping through PA's native trees and then setting them on fire, believe it or not, they are practicing conservation by cutting the trees down, essentially giving the forest a facelift and giving native species a fighting chance. There are downsides, of course, but in the end, the benefits far outweigh the bad. Clear cutting and forest regeneration are a good conservation method and truly help keep our forests healthy and biologically diverse. I'm Zach Salsgiver, and that's all for this special presentation of PA Wildlife Management.